So one question people are asking right now is it okay for me to accept the student loan forgiveness that President Biden just announced? As I'm recording this, President Biden has announced $10,000 or in some cases $20,000 of student loan forgiveness for certain people who are in student loan debt here in the States. That is expected to go to the courts where it will be challenged, and we don't know what will happen. But people who are in student loan debt are already asking, is it okay for me to receive that? Now, typically, people asking this question have certain opinions about whether or not this was a wise decision on President Biden's part or just decision, usually coming from those of us who think that the decision was at least unwise or perhaps unjust. And the thinking is like this. Should we really be, when our debt is spiraling out of control as a country, should we really be borrowing more money to pay back student loan debt for certain people in our country, knowing that our children and grandchildren who already will have to shoulder a massive national debt will now have to pay back even more? Or is that at least irresponsible, unwise, maybe even unjust, and stealing from our grandchildren? If you've got convictions like this and you're looking at it like that, then you may be asking, well, wait a minute, does that make it wrong for me to receive that money? Am I participating in injustice, or at least in government-sponsored folly if I take this money? Well, we're going to dive in and give as much of a biblical answer as we can today. Let's start at Romans 13. I got Romans 13 called up here because the political climate today trains us to think a little differently about government than probably we should. We typically think of government authorities in terms of how much we like what they're doing, right? We tend to watch a lot of people on TV, social media, other places, hearing a lot of opinions that are typically pretty critical of what they are doing, because people have found that that kind of sells in the media. That trains us to think kind of like armchair quarterbacks in football who have never actually played football but really think they know what that quarterback should have done. The Bible gives us a really different way of looking at government authorities, telling us in many places to give them honor, pay taxes where taxes are due, and it tells us why here in the first two verses of Romans 13. Here's what it says. Let every person be subject to the government authorities. For there's no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. So the idea here is that whatever system of government you live under it because God put it there and God put you under it. And whoever is filling all of those offices in the government you live under, all of those people are there because God put them there. Now, if God puts them there, who will they answer to? They will answer to God for what they do. Because if God put President Biden in office and gave him the authority to make this decision about student loan debt, and then gave the Supreme Court the authority to decide whether that is constitutional or not, who do they answer to for those decisions? They answer to God for those. So now we know who makes the decisions and who answers to who. And notice that so far you and I are not in the picture. We are not going to be answering to God for what someone else does. We'll be answering for what we do. What do we answer for? That's in verse 2. The one that resists those authorities resists what God has appointed. So if we resist them, we're resisting what God did. We're resisting God, and we incur judgment on ourselves because of that. Now that relieves a tremendous burden from off of our shoulders. No longer do we have to solve all the finer points of immigration. No longer do we have to figure out the economic factors behind this student loan decision. So much is lifted off of our shoulders. In fact, all we need to do is keep up with it enough to know if they're being faithful to their task and whether or not we should vote them back in or out of office when election day comes. God instituted that too, so we need to go do that. But apart from that, we don't have to worry too much about what they do. We just say, yes, sir. When they tax us too much, we say, yes, we don't think you should be doing that, but it doesn't matter. Yes, sir, here you go. And when they say, this much of your debt has been forgiven, or we're doing this for you, our job is not to resist, but to say, yes, sir, and let them answer for what they do. Now, beyond that, there's a little bit of precedent in the Bible that we should talk about. There is precedent in the Bible for the most destitute and hard up people in our country, and for very calamitous and disastrous situations, for the government to step in and take measures that it otherwise wouldn't take and we otherwise would be very uncomfortable with. This is true for the most destitute and poor in our country. The Mosaic Law does provide for them in the nation of Israel, in ancient Israel, a safety net, doing things for them that it would normally be doing, building structures and systems that help to rescue them or at least sustain them in ways they wouldn't do for everybody, in ways that couldn't be called socialism or communism, but just in ways that are generous and care for those who are very hard up and in need. You can see those precedents if you read through the Mosaic Law in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy. Beyond that, there is precedent in the book of Genesis in chapter 41 for the government stepping in times of great calamity. Joseph rises up to power because Pharaoh has a dream that there will be 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. Only he can't understand the dream, and Joseph does understand the dream, tells him what it means, warns him what's coming, and Joseph, God-fearing Joseph, gives the plan. Not the wicked government, God-fearing Joseph gives the plan. Why don't you store up all the abundance for 7 years? And then, in the 7 years of famine, hand out all that abundance that you stored up. So, government taking wealth from people, government handing out wealth. Something that a lot of us with conservative political views be very uncomfortable with. But, time of great calamity, God-fearing Joseph steps up, says this is what needs to be done, and it's done. So there is some precedent there, even for good and righteous people to take drastic measures like that. So the question facing President Biden right now is, when we don't have the silos stored up, is it right to borrow money in order to help? And is the post-COVID ballooning tuition cost situation a big disaster on par with the 7 years of famine that Egypt had? Now, I bet you've got opinions about that, and I do too. But here's the thing, back to Romans 13. It's not our call. And God isn't going to judge us for our opinions on that. You're not going to receive more reward in heaven because you knew what President Biden should have done. No, you will be judged for whether you cooperate with or resist whatever he does. That means in this situation, where the government is not asking us to deny Jesus Christ, the government is not asking us to worship it, the government is not doing the sort of things that give us merit and responsibility to say, no, sir, we will not do that, for we worship Jesus above all. If it's not that, if it's just writing checks and doing things like that, we look at them and we say, yes, sir, do what you will. If they're going to overtax us to pay for this, I'll get out my checkbook and I'll write the check. And if you're one of those people who would be receiving the student loan forgiveness and it comes to you, you may not even get a say in the matter. You may just see your bill go down or be eliminated. But the big principle I'm trying to communicate here is that cooperating with the government is not the same as endorsing what the government is doing or participating in their injustices. No, they answer for their injustices. You will answer for how you vote and whether you cooperate. So cooperating with that plan and receiving that money does not incur any kind of guilt on you, even if what they are doing may be wrong. There's the best biblical answer that I can give you. Hope it helps. Hope it relieves a lot of burden off of your shoulders and reminds you that you don't have to have an answer for every question and you don't have to know everything that the government ought to be doing at any given point.